Hello, my name is Abeer Siddiqui, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about unconscious bias and implicit bias and how that informs our profession and our perception of ourselves. So I wanted to talk a little bit about myself, of course, that's why I'm here. This is a picture of me at Cedar Grove in Vancouver Island. It's a great place, I highly recommend it. And I wanted to self-identify as a few things. So first of all, I am the School of Interdisciplinary Science Librarian at McMaster University. And so when I'm giving a talk, I usually talk a little bit about my position, which is entirely instructional. So all I do in my profession is go into classes, design courses, and teach around areas of science communication, science literacy, and science pedagogy. Those are my research focuses. But I never get the opportunity to talk about other things and other forms of identities that I identify with that don't necessarily make it up on the page. So for example, things like being a middle-class person, being a Pakistani Indian, being a woman, and of course, for me, being a Muslim person. And all of these identities also inform my practice just as much as my research interests, my educational background, and my professional background. So in my profession, in my career as an academic librarian, I do talk to students about science and storytelling. It's a very particular area of focus for me. And in my classes, we talk a little bit about the power in stories. So thinking about the narratives that we construct around ourselves and how they can inform both others' perception of ourselves as well as our perception of ourselves. And when we're thinking about unconscious bias, we should also be focusing on who gets to tell our stories. So this is actually a line from a song. It's from Hamilton, and it's who tells our stories. Because the people who tell our stories control not just our legacy, but who we are in the moment as well. So today, we'll be talking a little bit about defining and contextualizing unconscious bias. This will be a very brief part of our talk and our discussion today, but what I want to focus on specifically is thinking about identifying unconscious bias in the discipline, so the discipline of science, STEM in particular, and thinking about externalized bias. So how do the external forces, these unconscious biases of other people influence us? And also thinking about identifying unconscious bias in our cultural communities as well. So how do these internalized biases affect our profession and our perception of ourselves? So we're going to start off our discussion, again, by talking a little bit about unconscious or implicit bias. I'm going to be using unconscious and implicit interchangeably for the duration of this presentation. So first, I actually wanted to show a quick video from the Royal Society of Science in the UK about unconscious bias.
The unconscious mind is amazing. It can process vastly more information than our conscious mind by using shortcuts based on our background, cultural environment, and personal experiences to make almost instantaneous decisions about everything around us. The snag is, it's wrong quite a lot of the time, especially on matters that need rational thinking. Here's a classic example. A bat and a ball cost £1 10p. If the bat costs £1 more than the ball, how much does the ball cost? Most people, including over 50% of students at some of the world's leading universities, get the answer wrong and say 10p. The answer is actually 5p. Many of us choose 10p without thinking. This is because our unconscious mind uses instinct, not analysis. So our unconscious is fallible. It's also biased. It makes snap judgments of people we meet, categorizing them according to gender, social and other characteristics. In milliseconds, we judge whether somebody is like us and belongs to our in-group. These are the people we favor. So men might favor men, while women might favor women. However, we can belong to different in-groups, and we like to be part of an in-group that's powerful, which could mean a woman favoring a man over a woman. That's unconscious bias. All of us have it, and it colors our decisions without our realizing. For example, research reveals that if I were a man, you would be more likely to be nodding in agreement right now because people pay more attention to a male voice. The Royal Society fosters excellence in science, but this can only be achieved if we select from the widest range of talent. And that's not possible if unconscious bias is narrowing down the field for non-scientific reasons. To lessen the impact of unconscious bias, which is easier for us to notice in others, we are raising the awareness of unconscious bias to members of our selection and appointment panels. We're encouraging panel members to deliberately slow down decision-making, reconsider reasons for decisions, question cultural stereotypes, and monitor each other for unconscious bias. We can't cure unconscious bias, but with self-awareness, we can address it.
So that was a quick overview of what unconscious bias looks like, specifically thinking of it from a STEM perspective. I actually appreciate this video. I like how it delves deep into this notion and brings in a little bit of research, but I also really appreciate this definition that I got from Natasha Aurelia, specifically because she is a South Asian woman as well. So she writes, based on our learned cultural values and beliefs, which we think are universal, we evaluate and judge others, usually unconsciously when they behave differently. And I appreciate her emphasis on our lack of recognition of our culture and our experiences and how they play into our unconscious biases. So thinking about how we think that our cultural experiences are universal when they are absolutely not. And the notion that because of this, like will usually like. So thinking about people who look like us, people who sound like us, people who have the same types of values, cultural backgrounds, etc., are usually the ones that we will select into our in-group. And that is usually what happens. We're going to complicate this a little bit further when we go later into the presentation. So that is an overview of what unconscious bias or implicit bias looks like. Quick question for the people in this room. What cultural spaces and identities do we occupy? Do you occupy?
Just for myself, I definitely identify as a South Asian woman, so I tend to try and look for those in the room and gravitate automatically towards South Asian women when I see.
Right.
So, yeah.
So your cultural group being South Asian as well as female.
Yes.
Gendered in that way as well. Any other examples?
I'm South Asian, but coming from India and coming over here, I find that sometimes I'm stuck between two worlds. What do I do? How do I behave? What do I need to respond to? That sometimes it's a question.
Absolutely. So the notion of occupying both the space of South Asian women, gender again, but also the immigration narrative as well. So how do you occupy or present yourself as an immigrant in a place like North America? Yeah. Absolutely.
Anyone else? Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to echo that as well. I'm reminded of a quote from the movie Selena where the father is talking about going back and forth between Mexico and the United States. We're not Mexican enough for the Mexicans, we're not American enough for the Americans, and a lot of times growing up I felt that way as well, just in terms of being South Asian, yet growing up here, occupying one cultural identity at home and then a completely different one at school. So, yeah.
Right. That notion of occupying separate identities based on the people that you're surrounding yourself with. So feeling at home with one identity when you're with your family versus another identity when you're out with your peers or in a professional setting. Absolutely. There's actually a term for that. It's called third culture kids, right? So people who occupy both of them, but somehow occupy neither of those identities at the same time. So absolutely. So, yes, of course.
I want to get your perspectives.
Sure. Well, it's interesting for me because I identify as a white male, but I'm Jewish. And it's not a but, it's an and. But whether or not I'm Jewish is something that I choose to divulge in a crowd. It is not visible in any way. So that's one of the things that I think is really fascinating because I'm totally in control of whether and how and in what scenario that gets part of the conversation. And it's not often. And it is only often when I'm surrounded by other people who identify as Jewish. And so as someone who's also not particularly religious, it's just very interesting when that does come up and you end up finding yourself gravitating to these people and having conversations that isn't part of what I would normally be talking about in a social situation.
That is an excellent perspective. This notion of having the ability to self-identify when you feel comfortable, safe, or feel that it's relevant when other people might necessarily have that choice or other people sort of have that choice over them. Absolutely. So we can have a little bit of, we have had some time to think about the cultural spaces and identities that we occupy, but we should also think about how these cultural spaces inform and shape our biases against others. So you, for example, have mentioned that when you enter a room as a South Asian woman, you gravitate towards other South Asian women in the room as well. And that is a notion, or a form of unconscious bias, right? So this notion that because these people look familiar, because they must have some level of shared experience, I should be gravitating towards them. Are there any other examples that would that pop to your mind?
Yeah, I find sometimes if it's not necessarily a South Asian woman, it's probably someone who's alone by themselves in the back of the room, and I would probably gravitate towards them because I am also the kind of person that'd be alone and back in the room.
Right.
It's looking for those signs of who feels the most similar
Right.
externally anyways until you get to know them.
Yeah. It seems like you guys are very conscious of your unconscious bias.
I find that a lot in networking events. Since I've started going to a few of them, now I'm seeing that undergraduates go towards undergraduates, or South Indians go towards South Indians, but they form their niche.
Right.
There's pockets, and then when they're comfortable, they talk, but otherwise they close the pockets.
Absolutely. So you're right. That's quite evident in networking events where you will see, even when you just walk into the room, in-groups have already formed and people have found commonalities between themselves and sort of inadvertently excluded others from that space as well. So I have an example of an unconscious bias that I had in my own practice. So one of the identities that I occupy is that of an instructor or a teacher, right? So I'm in classrooms, usually big lecture halls, and I'm teaching 300 to 400 students. And there are always a bunch of students, 3 to 4 students per class who are active, who participate in class discussion, and usually are the first people to raise their hands when I ask a question, a discussion question. And I find myself gravitating towards them. And I find myself thinking that the people who aren't raising their hands, the people who are quiet and are on their laptops typing away, that they're not paying attention, or that they're not good students in some way, and that they're not participating, therefore they're not learning. And that is a bias that I have, right? That I'm unfairly thinking of them as not good students. Maybe that is not their learning style. Maybe they don't feel comfortable speaking in a classroom of 400 students, which is absolutely understandable. And that part of acknowledging my unconscious bias has been, in these past couple of years, is creating opportunities in my classrooms where those students can still participate, not necessarily by raising their hand. So having clicker questions, or having small group discussions that they can have with their peers rather than with me in front of a big lecture hall, things like that. So again, for me, it's been a situation of recognizing the unconscious bias and then thinking of strategies to address it in the classroom for the people who have been influenced by that bias as well. So, in summary, diversity in STEM in science has been limited by unconscious bias at a lot of levels, and that we should be addressing and identifying our own biases. And of course, I've also listed some helpful resources. So the Royal Society, which is where that video came from, have a significant amount of resources on how to address unconscious bias when you're sitting in a position of power. When you have decision-making authority, what can you do to help the people in the room?